Hello, and welcome to the second lecture on Chapter 3. So now we're going to move on and talk about the limbic system. And so we're going to look at these structures that are on the most inner parts of the brain: the basal ganglia, the thalamus, hippocampus, the hypothalamus, which is right here, the amygdala, and we'll do the cerebral cortex in our next lecture. So the limbic system is also called subcortical structures. These play a key part in psychological functioning. So we've got the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the basal ganglia. So those are the structures of the limbic system that we're going to look at. So the first structure is the hypothalamus, and that is this tiny little structure right here. It's in yellow, and it's really little, but it does a lot. It's the brain's regulatory system. It controls the autonomic nervous system, or if you remember from my previous lecture, I talked about how one of the easiest ways to remember what the autonomic nervous system is to just think of it as the automatic nervous system. So the hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system, the endocrine system, and it also controls your circadian rhythms or your body clock. And it's called the brain within the brain because it controls the brain, or many parts of the brain. It's critical to motivation and emotion, and it is part of the reward system of the brain. So we've got the hypothalamus right here. Then we have the thalamus. Let me show you. So this purple structure, on top of it is basal ganglia, which is blue. This purple structure is the thalamus. If you can find the thalamus, you can find the hypothalamus. It's right underneath it. So the thalamus is the gateway to the brain. It's a switchboard, and it organizes input from sensory organs, and it sends that information to the right areas of the brain. So when you hear something, that auditory information is sent to the thalamus, and the thalamus tells that auditory information where it needs to go to in the brain. Because there are specific areas of the brain that process sound, that process language. If you see something, the thalamus is going to send that information to the visual cortex so that you can actually see. Your eyes are part of the visual system, but they're not what sees. It's your brain that tells you what you see. So the thalamus is key for getting information where it needs to go. This regulates awareness, attention, motivation, emotional aspects of memory. And so something you're going to see is how, yes, I want you to know what each part of the brain is primarily responsible for, but based on last lecture, I think you're starting to get an idea of how some psychological phenomena are controlled by more than just one part of the brain. And awareness and attention and motivation and emotion are topics like that. They require that different parts of the brain work together to give you the whole human experience. Okay, so we've got the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And then we get to the hippocampus. Now, you have two of these. They're called hippocampi. You have a right and a left hippocampus. And the hippocampus is key to your memory system. It's critical for forming, storing, and retrieving memories. It's the first part of the brain where it was discovered that neurogenesis occurs, that new neurons can grow. I want to be kind of clear about this. Neurogenesis is kind of tends to be oversimplified, and there's a lot of competing information on whether or not the adult brain grows new neurons. A lot of what I've been reading lately is saying that, once you're in adulthood, neurogenesis is done. You're pretty much done growing new cells. It used to be believed that you only had as many neurons as you were born with. Well, we now know that neurogenesis happens, that the human brain can grow new neurons. But a lot of the research right now is showing that that is a child and say, birth to mid-teens, birth to early 20s, that neurogenesis is limited. What they also have found, though, with the hippocampus, and we know that this is the case for other parts of the brain now, is that the brain can change in size based on how it's used. So the hippocampus, they have found that people that engage in memory, what's the word I'm looking for? Memory-intensive tasks, their parts of their hippocampi are actually larger. And it's the part of the hippocampus that controls spatial memory. Memory for where things are in space. Okay, so we've got the hippocampus right here. Now I want you to go to Moodle, and in the folder titled Chapter 3, Biology and Behavior Lecture Videos, you'll find a video titled London Taxi Drivers. Please watch that now. Welcome back. So, going back to the hippocampus, that video does a great job of showing you how parts of the brain can increase based on extensive use of that part of the brain. So I'm a cellist. The areas of my brain that control fine motor movement in the hand are going to be slightly larger. You'd need a microscope to tell the difference on all of this, but would be slightly larger than those who don't play stringed instruments, because stringed instruments require a very specific type of fine motor skill. You'll find this with athletes too. Parts of their brain, spatial memory is part of that, of sports. Anything that requires very specific skills, the more you do that, the more you change your brain. Your brain is not static. It is an ever-evolving process, an organ that continues to develop. I don't know if you've been to London. I have. London is insane. It's a almost 3,000-year-old city, still trying to function as a modern city. It's insane. Oh my God. I would never drive in London. Okay, then we get to the amygdala. So the amygdala is this little bean-like shaped structure right here. And as you can see, it's attached to the hippocampus. It's right next to the hippocampus. So the amygdala is your emotional center of the brain, especially fear and aggression. I'll come back to that in just a second. The amygdala organizes motivational and emotional response patterns. And the amygdala is part of your memory system. So it's critical for emotion. But when it comes to putting a memory together, memory is a whole brain activity. So we just talked about the hippocampus and how that's responsible for storing, retrieving, and forming memories. But when let's say, remember your earliest birthday party. So you dig in the rumbles of your mind and you bring up that memory. Now there's the story of the birthday party, and there's the emotion of the birthday party. You have to remember the emotion. And it's really hard to have a memory of the event itself without experiencing the emotion that came with it. Now, I'm not saying you have the same set and heightened sense of emotion, but you have a memory of whether or not or you have a sense of, was that memory pleasant or unpleasant, or, how did you feel in that event? So memory works a lot like a jigsaw puzzle. And when it comes to putting memories together to bring them back into conscious awareness, the amygdala holds the emotional content of that memory. The hippocampus has the actual story. But these two structures have to talk to each other to give you a whole memory, to give you the story with the emotion. And the emotion gives us context and relevance to that memory. Interestingly, in the brains of psychopaths, they have smaller amygdalas. And they think that this might be one of the reasons why people who are psychopaths have very low fear. They're not afraid of things like the rest of us are. It's a really interesting idea. Okay, now the amygdala, it intensifies memory function during periods of intense physiological arousal. So anytime, you're in an event that it triggers intense emotion, and it doesn't have to be negative emotion, it can be positive emotion, any type of intense emotion, the amygdala intensifies in its ability to format and store the emotional content of that memory. And the amygdala also helps us analyze other people's facial expressions for emotion. And that's key for communication. Then we get to the basal ganglia, which is right here, kind of covers the thalamus. So it's this blue structure right here. And this is a subcortical structure that they're important for the planning and production of movement. So we'll talk about movement in the next lecture in more detail, but the basal ganglia is also related to movement. It's also part of the reward system. So anything that is part of the reward system is linked to dopamine. And dopamine is your pleasure neurotransmitter. When you do something that feels really good, your brain is being flooded with dopamine. And so a lot of these subcortical structures are part of that reward system. Okay, thank you.